Thanks for tuning in to Kolb's Connections, your one-stop shop for getting a 5 on your AP Gov test. This series of videos is going to highlight the main ideas and concepts that I want you to look over and review before the test. There's going to be 11 of these videos. Today's video is going to focus on Unit 1, Foundations, the underpinnings of our Constitution. First thing I want you to remember is the philosophy of our framers. When you use the word political philosophy, what you're thinking is, what is the worldview our framers had? Remember that our Constitution was drafted in an era when many governments thought that their power was directly handed to them from God. This idea is known as the divine right of kings. Our founders did not agree with this worldview. They saw the absolute power that monarchs were able to hold over their people and were against it. But they did realize that in order to have our rights protected, we had to give up certain other rights. You do this kind of thing all the time. You realize that watching a movie in a movie theater is much more difficult when annoying people are talking. So when you enter a movie theater, you give up your First Amendment right of speech in order to better enjoy the movie. This idea is known as the social contract, giving up some freedoms in order to have other freedoms protected by the government. So as part of our social contract, we give up our right to rule ourselves and instead defer to the institutions to govern for us. This really flips the authority of government on its head. Rather than authority coming from God, you see authority is actually coming from us, the people, because of the social contract. The government exists because we, the people, allow it to exist. The government derives its power because we consent to it governing us. This idea is known as popular sovereignty. So, with a great foundational hold of these philosophies, our founders are ready to go out and write a constitution, building on the ideas of Locke and Hobbes. Fresh off of drafting the Declaration of Independence, the biggest breakup letter the world has ever seen, the Continental Congress took on their next task, which was drafting a constitution, the first document for us to try to govern ourselves with. The name of the Constitution was the Articles of Confederation. We called ourselves the League of Friendship under those. And you remember that these articles had some glaring weaknesses, but the government under the articles did do some pretty neat things. First off, under this government run by the articles, we were able to win the Revolutionary War and successfully negotiate an end to that war. It was also under these articles that the government was able to set the precedent that's still followed today, known as federalism, the model that sets up states and central governments working together with separate roles but also shared concurrent powers. As we know, there were insurmountable weaknesses in these articles, and ultimately it was these weaknesses that caused the destruction of the articles. Some of these weaknesses were the inability of the government to pay off the Revolutionary War debt, having each state have its own set of currency, having no Supreme Court, no executive branch, and no way to tax the people. These inefficiencies ultimately culminate with Shays' Rebellion, which showed really how inefficient the articles were. Shays' Rebellion, you remember, pretty crazy time, literally thousands of farmers with pitchforks attacking an arsenal, protesting that all their farms are being closed. Massachusetts really needed the help of a federal military, but you remember it didn't exist. Our founders quickly realized that this government they fought so hard to create was on the brink of falling apart. So they called together a convention to just patch up these articles. They quickly realized that there was way more work to be done than just patching up the articles. And so they threw out the Articles of Confederation completely, and now it's time to draft a constitution. To draft a constitution, there were several issues that would have to be addressed before we could even begin writing. The first, how should we handle representation in the legislative lawmaking body? Small states rallied behind the New Jersey plan, saying every state, big or small, should have the same number of votes. Big states obviously had a big problem with this, so they rallied behind their idea, the Virginia plan, saying Congress would be based on proportion. Larger states would have more votes than small states. Lots of fighting between these two things. Several small states threatened to walk away from the table if this wasn't solved. It was solved with the Connecticut Compromise, which was a great compromise, which created a bicameral legislative branch. Remember, bicameral, Latin word meaning two houses. Now, in the House of Representatives, big states are happy because they have more votes than small states in the House. And you remember that the happiness for the small states is found in the Senate, where big or small, every state has 2 votes in the Senate. The next problem these men are going to have to debate is how do we deal with this issue of slavery? The southern states know that when it comes to the House of Representatives, the more people that live in their state, the more representatives they'll have in the House. And so the southern states want to count slaves. The northern states reply to them, "You're not treating them as people. Why should we count them as people?" Again, a lot of fighting here, and the compromise that solved this was the 3/5 compromise, which said for every 5 slaves your state has, 3 of them will count towards representation. This is not saying that an African was worth 3/5 of a person, just this was simply for counting for representation. Despite all the work that went into this new Constitution, there were still several groups of people who were against this Constitution. Supporters and opponents of the Constitution are put into 2 groups, Anti-Federalists and Federalists. Those who supported the Constitution were known as Federalists because the Constitution gave more federal power than the Articles of Confederation did. Those against the Constitution's passage were known as Anti-Federalists because they thought it gave too much federal power to a national government. Key Federalists, to try to convince the nation about the positive aspects of the Constitution, wrote newspaper articles entitled the Federalist Papers. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay wrote the majority of these. Federalist 10 and Federalist 78 are 2 of the more famous ones you probably should take a look at. Anti-Federalists who were against the government at the time because they thought it gave the government too much federal power would be absolutely outraged at the current levels of federal aggrandizement, meaning how much larger our federal government is now than it was meant to be. There are portions of the Constitution that have enabled this federal growth. The first is the Necessary and Proper Clause, also sometimes referred to as the Elastic Clause, because what it has done, it has allowed the government to stretch its power and authority by telling Congress that they can make any laws that they can prove are necessary and proper. Examples of this is Congress creating district courts and circuit courts, neither of which are actually even mentioned in the Constitution. Another way government has increased its size and power is through presidential practice. One device used by the president is the executive order. These orders have the same effect of the law, but it circumvents and bypasses Congress. Another thing is you remember the president's the chief diplomat. He's in charge of negotiating foreign policy with other countries and drafting treaties. But you remember treaty needs the advice and consent approval of the Senate. If the president wants to eliminate the need for Congress, he can create an executive agreement, which has same elements of a treaty, but you don't need Congress for it. Both of those have shown the president, executive branch, stretching his power as well. This federal aggrandizement is not limited to Congress and the president, but also has worked its way now into our courts. This is evident through issues like today, the Supreme Court making the decision on same-sex marriage. Never before would we have guessed that the Supreme Court would be taking center stage with such an important domestic policy. But we really see the federal power of the Supreme Court evolve, starting with Marbury versus Madison. Here it was decided that the Supreme Court could exercise judicial review and stop both the president and Congress from doing things that they deem unconstitutional. Again, when the Supreme Court was created, we remember Federalist Paper 78 said the Supreme Court was the least dangerous branch, and now we can think of numerous times that it has overturned both Congress and the president. The last thing you want to remember as we look into these constitutional underpinnings is that the 27 amendments that we associate with our Constitution actually originally were not part of it. They were passed later. Now, as you look at the amendments, key ones, if I were you, that I would focus on are the Bill of Rights. Make sure you know those and can think of some cases that go along with those. And I would pay special attention to the 14th Amendment, which lays the framework for selective incorporation, something we will talk much more about on our civil rights video. Thanks for tuning in to Kolb's Connections, and I wish you luck on the test.